Ladies and gentlemen, I talked first, so I guess I'm introducing this episode because we're trying something new this time. This is our spring special / megasode on Dune parts 1 and 2. Last time we did a spring special, I think, was The Batman, which was 2 years ago, I think. I don't think we did one the year between. Or maybe my senior year of college just feels like a lot longer ago than it was. But either way, we're here now. We're talking about Denis Villeneuve's Dune and maybe a little bit about just Dune in particular. And we're going hostless. We're just having a free-form discussion. So prepare for a lot of... Did you have something to say? Well, why don't you... I'm predicting a lot of that, but maybe not. So yeah, Dune. What did we think of Dune? I don't want to just go straight into my own thoughts since we're trying to scatter this about a bit more.
Well, clearly Zach is the host. We've already ruined everything. He's asking us questions.
Did we want to introduce it perfectly in unison? Is that what we wanted to do?
Yeah.
We'll use the voice.
We'll be like the Bene Gesserit hive mind. Yeah,
it's a dude. Zach is just the mother. The Reverend Mother.
Welcome to Cookie Pocket.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, I'll just say my first issue with this is I really liked the idea of viewing both films and doing one episode on both of them. And I thought it would be a lot easier than it is, at least for me, because, same cast, obviously, same director, Denis, and Hans Zimmer's back, etc. But I had a pretty different impression of both films, and I think that's because of where I was coming from when I saw each of them. I saw the first one with zero knowledge of the book or lore or like anything. I think I knew my dad had read it, but he hadn't even given me any of the basics. And I saw it alone in the theater. And I rewatched it this year when they did that like weekend or so IMAX re-release of it. And again, went to the theater, saw it alone, and it was very fun. And still hadn't read the book at that point. I had like a slightly better cultural knowledge of it, I guess. And after seeing that, I was kind of like, I've got like a solid month and a half of time before part 2 comes out. Am I ever going to read the book? Because I keep putting it off, and I'm a student still, and not a ton of time, but it was like, you know what? I like this first movie so much. I think I'll try to read the book before I see part 2, and that'll make it more fun. It'll be more of an event for me. And unfortunately, I think I kind of, I don't want to say I ruined part 2 for myself, but I do think I canceled out my ability to view it in a more objective way, in a way that wasn't just kind of finger pointing and saying, that's not like what it was in the book. And I was that way, especially when I was a kid, I think. And it's easy to be that way when all of your English teachers are bludgeoning you over the head with the book is always better than the movie. But, okay, there's so much ground to cover, and I'm already taking up so much time. But I gave the first one a 4.5, and I gave the second one a 2.5. And a lot of that, it's hard for me to say how much of that is just disappointment from it being different from the book. And Zach mentioned in one or both of his reviews that the second half is just much harder to adapt, and I think that's totally true. So I think it's very possible that I see part 2 again, I elevate it up to like a 3 or 3.5, or even a 4, and I view it charitably and I'm able to enjoy it. But at least for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to try to be loyal to my first impression of it. And I think that'll be more interesting anyway, because I think both of you had a more positive experience with part 2. But that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, they are. I was also struck by, because I saw part 1 at an early critic screening back when it first came out. And as I mentioned in my second review of part 1, which I posted a couple days ago, because I saw part 2 and then I rewatched part 1 for this episode. When I saw it, I was really looking forward to it. I was a big fan of the books. I had seen the Lynch version, and I was pumped. And I had a really bad case of mono and a terrible headache that developed during the film. So even I spent most of the film kind of in my chair going, oh, it's a beautiful movie. I wish it would end so I could go home.
It felt the 4D experience.
Yeah, it felt like the longest movie in the world. But rewatching it, it moves pretty quickly, but I am struck by how different the two films are. I feel like I remember reading that Villeneuve didn't write part two until he knew he was able to make it or something like that. They made part one without part two being greenlit. And I could recognize that in a few, there's definitely some stylistic differences. Part two feels a lot bigger, but there's also plot elements from the book that are directly referred to in part one that just don't happen in part two at all. Mitchell, I don't know if you've read the book or are familiar with the story, but there's, Christian will know what I'm talking about on this front. There's this whole thing in the book where they teach the Fremen the weirding way, which is this particular form of combat that the Bene Gesserit are familiar with. And that's not mentioned at all in Dune Part 2, but that's like a big part of kind of why they win in the book, or at least it's hinted at being a major element of how Paul turns the Fremen into a force that can go out on this holy war across the universe. Not even mentioned in the movie, but in Part 1, they point out that Jessica is a weirding woman when she beats Stilgar in combat. And that seems like setup for something that doesn't come back in part two. So little things like that did surprise me, even though I gave both films 4s and liked part two quite a bit.
Mitchell Al-Gaib. I am the chosen one because I did not read the book, and that makes me technically the better audience member because I experienced it the way it was supposed to be experienced. Well, so I really enjoyed both of them, but I think going into the first one, even after seeing the Lynch version, which I do think it does help as supplemental material and kind of getting you prepared for what sort of universe you're in and what kind of like the general concerns are of everything and how weird the story could get. And then when you're going into the first one, you realize it's not going to be nearly that weird, but there's going to be a lot of ground that's going to be attempted to be covered in a very, even relative to the book, a very short amount of time. So I think that what the first film does so well is it immerses you and builds a world that's entirely believable and makes you feel really small and makes you feel like you're really invested into a massive idea and you're trying to figure out every aspect of it, and you're trying to understand this world. And I mean, just thinking about how films were 50 years ago, like the standards are significantly higher. Like you're fighting against basically everything, trying to make another sci-fi film, even if it's just based off of material that already existed. Trying to make another sci-fi film that's entirely believable, that even though it has great production and everything, like you have these characters that don't feel like they're shoehorned in. You feel like it's not just some random things happening. Like the Lynch version had kind of that issue where it just felt very random and haphazard. This feels very, very intentional, very easy to invest in. Like it doesn't feel long at all, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the first one. And really, the second one for me is still great and excels in a lot of the areas that the first one kind of set up for it. There's so much that feels like it's missing that was cut out. And even as, someone who hadn't actually read the book, once you've seen enough adaptations, you start to recognize like the pitfalls and recognize where it's possible that there were storylines that were like just skipped over or kind of just like cut for the sake of whatever. And I feel like that happened so many times in the second one for me. I felt like there's a lot of prioritization. Like we have to have this action scene. This action scene has to have a beginning and an end. It has to have the whole thing play out. And I felt like the action in a lot of ways was prioritized more than trying to make like a nuanced story when it comes to like the Bene Gesserit and the Lisan al-Gaib and the prophet stuff. Like because all the prophet stuff to me just sounded like it was straight out of like the Iliad or something, or any like Shakespeare, like Macbeth or something. Like there's so many, the dialogue felt very simplified and very just not tight at all. And I don't know why, but it just felt very hard for me to invest in the story. I felt like I basically already knew what the story was going into it. Not that like, seeing the Lynch one, obviously that helped too, but like it's just hard for me to like feel like I was learning anything new. And that was very frustrating coming out of the first one where I felt like I was doing nothing but learning something new the whole time. So that whiplash for me is kind of what made me ding the sequel a lot more. But the action is fantastic. For the most part, the supporting actors are fantastic. I'll agree with Christian on Timothy and Zendaya and stuff, but we'll get into that later. But yeah, that's my assessment of both as a normie.
Yeah, I do think you make a really good point about the prophecy stuff. Because it's not played this way in the book, but I feel the best way filmically to present this idea that Paul is a messiah, but he really isn't, because that's all been set up by the Bene Gesserit, is they should really, I feel like that should be played as a twist or a surprise. It isn't played that way in the book, but I feel like that would be the most dramatically effective way to present that in film. But they really don't do that in parts 1 or 2. I thought, by my memory, I thought part 2 at the beginning, they just kind of go, oh, by the way, this thing they believe in isn't actually real. And I was like, oh, okay, are we meant to be surprised at that? But they do mention that in part 1. They mention like the Bene Gesserit have been programming these people to believe these things. And that does feel, I mean, Dune is full of things that if you adapt them as literally as possible to film, they're just going to be boring and kind of weird. Which you see from the Lynch version. That's one of those things that I think they adapted literally that maybe they shouldn't have as much. I do think they could have moved that reveal around to be more dramatically effective. But that does also, I think, kind of tie into my immediate reaction to Christian's review of part 2 when I saw it, which was that I personally don't have much of a problem with changes being made to an original narrative in an adaptation, because I think an adaptation in and of itself implies and necessitates change of some kind. And sometimes that's for the better. I think a great example of that would be like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Sure.
Those are not really literal adaptations of the books at all, at least if you're watching the theatrical editions. The extended editions do have a lot of scenes that are cut out. I feel that's to their detriment, but even then, like tonally, character-wise, plot-wise, there's a lot of stuff cut out of those, but it makes them better movies than a direct adaptation of the books would have been. And I get that feeling from Dune Part 2, because as we saw from the Lynch version, I mean, even if that movie had more time, like an attempt to adapt Part 2 or the second half of the book in that form is just disastrous. It like you can immediately tell when they hit the harder part of the book to adapt, because the crossfades start coming in, and basically all that crossfade section of the Lynch movie is part 2. And to my surprise, it was my favorite between the two of them.
I think you make a good point about the necessity of changes for adaptations, and I will say in part 1, if you're looking purely at how much they mirror the book, I do think part 1 is probably the most literally loyal and has fewer changes, but it's not without its changes. And I think the changes that part 1 does make are definitely positive changes. In the book, there are several chapters where Atreides and a bunch of people, after they make this big move to Arrakis, are just kind of hand-wringing about who the traitor is going to be. And that goes on for kind of a really long time, and it feels unnecessary. And there's like a dinner scene with some other, I don't even remember if it's like royals or people that are associated with the spice production, and that's kind of mercifully cut. And there's a lot more going on with Hawat, the Mentat, I forget what his stance is, I guess, general, but I think all of those omissions contribute to the pacing of the film and the feeling of it. And for part 2, I feel like I just have to go into all the changes that were made now. I'm sorry, Mitchell, if you plan on reading
it's all right.
it. But
no, I don't.
So some things are absolutely necessary. Like, okay, in the book, Paul's sister, Alia, who is mostly a fetus and is in one vision played by Anya Taylor-Joy. Yeah. In the book, she is born, and she's 2 years old, and I think eventually 4 years old by the end of the book. And her whole thing is that she behaves and speaks and thinks like a fully developed adult with
Jack.
a superhuman level of intelligence. And it's just
Jack
this
from The Incredibles.
but worse. It's like,
And we do see her in the
Jack.
Lynch version. She's there very, very briefly, but she is there and like speaks in a little voice like this. It's
Which feels like not the best choice either. But, not only is she this, like, she's born and she's present and she's like unnerving everyone around her, but she is eventually captured. And in the book, she's the one that kills the Baron, not Paul, as a 4-year-old.
I can see the issue.
And also, there's this huge emotional beat. So, okay, before I move on from that, I don't think there's any way in a live action film to filmically realize, even if you aged her up to like a kid in like the 7 to 9-year-old age, I don't think you're going to be able to find a child actor that can convincingly behave with the like intellect and gravity of Rebecca Ferguson, plus maybe even more, at least how the character is written in the book. So with that in mind, I guess that's a concession. But there's some big emotional beats that I don't think would have taken necessarily a ton of time or effort to keep in there. And the two I'm thinking of the most are, one, Paul and Chani have a child in the book.
yes.
The child is captured and killed by the Harkonnens. And to me, that is like the emotional climax of the book. Even though it's not given, it's Shakespearean in the sense that it happens between chapters or off stage or off screen, as it were. But it's still a really big deal. And it also serves to highlight the fidelity between Paul and Chani at this point. And the ending is another thing for me. But and another big emotional moment in the book is when the first time Gurney and Paul reunite, the first time Wonka and Thanos reunite. There's when they embrace each other and realize that, you know, there's this connection, they recognize each other. The Fremen have already killed like a lot of the smugglers that Gurney is with. And when Gurney first assesses Paul, he has kind of this chilling realization that Paul has become this like brutal killer, and that his instincts and his sort of political knowledge, he's moved away from the Atreides base and more towards this Fremen tradition, and it's very unnerving to him. And that's like a really big moment in the book, but in the movie they just kind of hug and it's over in 5 seconds. So I don't know. I think both of those things would have taken, like the Gurney thing would have taken another 20 seconds maybe, and the child thing maybe like several minutes, admittedly. But I still think they would have been more loyal to the book and would have added to the emotion of the drama of part 2.
Do you think we have the necessary relation to Gurney from part 1 and the little introduction that we get to him in part 2 that kind of beat would have worked? Because in my head, I feel like it would have, that even if they did that, it maybe would have felt a little bit alien, because we don't really get to know Gurney that much in part 1. So my immediate reaction, I feel like, would be like, well, what did he think Paul was before? Because a lot of the affection in the book between Gurney and Paul is in part 1 presented between Paul and Duncan. He kind of becomes the affectionate outlet for that character, and Gurney becomes the grump.
Yeah, that's a good point. And he is this kind of like weapons master. So even in part 1 of the Atreides, he's implied to have that sort of brutal instinct more than the others, I guess. So yeah, I guess that could be a potential problem. I guess I still would see that scene as more of a means of framing his realization as an audience realization, or just better communicating the way Paul has changed. And this is another thing that I'm not sure if I'm too sensitive still because of the changes from the book. I feel like I loved Timothy in part 1. I felt like in part 2, he was kind of forcing things a little bit more, and I didn't feel like I saw the character change as much as he's supposed to by the end of the film. But did you guys, did you, I guess not just for Timothy, but for the others, did you observe a lapse in performance quality between the two films?
So I think this kind of goes into what I mentioned in my review, where I felt like, I guess the scale of the war is like, the scale in general, I guess, is bigger in the second one, but the way it's filmed and like the progression of his character and like the assessment of whether or not he's a prophet type thing by the Fremen is like, it feels like a bunch of TV episodes almost. And I guess I just think that it's like, or like a very, very long montage. Like it's a very long montage of him like going through these trials, I guess you could say. And like, I just get sick of Zendaya's like grumpy face all the time. And that's a part of it too. But also I just think like, I just felt like the same ideas kept getting reiterated. Like the same characters already fell into their archetypes, and that there wasn't really any chance of them escaping them. So if they're going to stay in their same archetypes and stick with the same like two things that they want, then they should really flesh that out a lot more in their performance. And I feel like Javier Bardem is a great contrast to Timothy in this sense, because he does like have nuance to his like thinking. Like maybe he's questioning this, or like he's assessing it in a different way, or he's trying to maintain the order and the belief in this way. And I just don't feel like I feel like he's kind of just like the projectile, or he's like the one that's like launching the whole thing, and he's more of a representative than he is like an actual leader, I guess. And I don't know if that's like too overt of a criticism, but I think I don't get the sense that he's leading a whole lot. I kind of just feel like I get that's the sense of like being a prophet, where it's like it's blind faith and that you're just supposed to have faith in him. Mm-hmm. But I do think it kind of degrades how convincing he is as a character and as like a formidable opponent to the Harkonnen.
Especially in the scene when he kind of uses the voice. There's this pressure that he has to kill Stilgar, Bardem, to become the true leader of the Fremen. And he kind of uses the voice and this like charisma of maybe like a beloved political leader to kind of rally the crowd and accept this change. And in that scene, it does sometimes feel to me like he's just shouting as opposed to like hitting the notes and really interacting with the crowd.
Mm-hmm. I'll kind of wrap my way back around to the performance note, but I did want to mention I don't like the way the voice has been adapted in any screen version of Dune, because reading Dune, I got the feeling that the voice was like you kind of mentioned, Christian. It's this very particular kind of way of pitching your voice that the Bene Gesserit have discovered, where it makes it's almost like hypnotism, where it makes people more suggestible and it makes it easier for you to suggest things to them. To me, in the book, that didn't really come across as something that would be constant shouting with like a rumble under it. And in every version of Dune, the Lynch version, the TV versions, Dune Part 1 and 2, the voice is just like shouting with like a bassy groan put into it. Like to me, reading the book, I felt the voice would be much more kind of calm because it required concentration. Maybe all other sound goes out and you just hear their voice. That's getting into like sound editing notes, but it does bug me how the voice is, especially in that scene, where maybe he would have to kind of raise his voice in that case because it is a big room of people. But the voice just becomes, I'm gonna shout at you really loud. In terms of performances, though, I wasn't necessarily bugged by performance in Part 2 and it wasn't even bugged, but rewatching Part 1, I was struck by some of the characters are written in a noticeably different way in Part 2. In Part 1, Stilgar is very gruff and seldom speaks and is quite intimidating and imposing and feels like a difficult person to impress. And Part 2, he's a lot smoother. He cracks some jokes. He's used for comic relief sometimes, and he's totally convinced that Paul is the Lisan al-Gaib, which I would potentially buy if we felt that that Lady Jessica and Paul had been with them for a little bit longer. But I think based on the start of Part 2, that it's meant to be pretty immediately after Part 1. I don't think any great stretch of time has passed here for them to have ingratiated themselves. Other characters that I noticed feeling different were I think the Baron Harkonnen. In part one, he's very menacing, and he's portrayed as, I don't really even know what kind of comparison to make, but he's this kind of he's very threatening. He feels kind of like a monstrous presence where he's big and he might look slow, but he's like a snake. You got to be careful, because if you let your guard down, he's gonna and get you.
It's just like Snoke. Yep.
Geez.
And I think that comes across in the scene where I think the House Mentat and he and maybe the Reverend, no, not the Reverend Mother, whoever the head of the Bene Gesserit is, I forget that actress's name. They're talking with like the sound shield on Giedi Prime, and he like raises up on his levitators, and he has this big cloak, and it kind of looks like, I mean, it has the posture of like, a snake rising up to threaten. And in part two, and I know that he's, I guess, still recovering from Duke Leto's poison, or maybe he never has recovered. The reason he goes into the bath in part one is because of the poison tooth. And then he has like this life support thing with him, but he's a much more kind of sedentary character in part two, who's kind of sitting back and manipulating things. And that's not a bad characterization, I think, but it is quite different from part one. And I don't think the transition is as smooth as it could be with a lot of the characters, I think.
That whole arena scene is different, because in the book, it's not even the whole thing of the Atreides man not being poisoned or whatever is not the Baron's doing, but Feyd-Rautha and who I mentioned earlier, Hawat, the Mentat of House Atreides, survives, and the Harkonnens like capture him and try to corrupt him, and it's kind of ambiguous about how much they succeed in doing that. But
and he was, I think, going to be in this movie. They shot his scenes and they had to cut them for time, I think.
Oh, damn, don't tell me that.
Which
it's a two now.
Villeneuve
Crap.
said he was like really painful, but like it was a timing thing, a pacing thing. I think Tim Blake Nelson was also going to play Fennec. I think that's the character's name. Who's like
Tim Blake
Oh
Nelson.
my gosh, stop
he had to be
it.
cut
Oh
too.
my God,
Yeah.
Zach, I'm going to cry. That's terrible. Oh, that was going to be my next thing, because Lea Seydoux plays Lady Margot. And in the book, there's this whole thing where Feyd-Rautha's going to dedicate that arena fight to her, and then the Baron's like all upset at him for it. And the Count Fenring, her like betrothed, is there when Rautha does this. And her just like being there on her own, just it kind of makes less sense. And I guess they were just trying to make her another one of the Bene Gesserit without expanding on the royal house element of things more. But that's so brutal, especially because Denis seems really reluctant to put deleted scenes on the Blu-ray or anything.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that ruined my day.
Yeah, since you did mention... Oh, sorry, Mitchell, were you going to
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I really liked the arena scene. I think it did. I was worried at first that it was kind of just thrown in as like, well, we just need an origin story type deal, and I just felt like it kind of it started to sync up a little bit better towards the end, and obviously Austin Butler is pretty solid, coming off of Masters of the Air, but
There it is.
a little weird, but it's fine. Buzz. Yeah, he's pretty interesting choice. I just, like I said, I think it's just that same criticism when it comes to I just feel like I'm not in a big epic anymore. I don't feel like I feel like I'm getting lost in the pages of like reading about some random other story that's going on at the same time, and I'm kind of just waiting for it to connect back again. I guess like it wasn't as bothersome once it actually played out. I was just bothered by the fact that I was anticipating it, I guess would be my final thoughts on that.
Huh. That's interesting, because rewatching part one, I was struck by how much smaller everything felt than part two. And obviously, we've still got these big wide shots. We've still got events taking place on a planetary scale. But so many of the shots in part one focus on a single character, a single group of characters. I feel like in part two, every scene is like clamoring with extras doing other things, and it makes the world feel so much bigger. I think that arena scene is a great example, because we got all the people in the stands. We got that kind of thronging sound in the sound mix, and I love the look of that scene as well. Ironically, it really gives the movie a pop of color, because it takes us away from Arrakis, where things are so orange and brown, and even if the sun is setting, we're still within that palette. And here on Giedi Prime, it's this very stark black and white, which they got by shooting it all in infrared, I think, which is just really interesting technique-wise. Something that does really bug me, the only thing that really irritated me that they left out of the books was Fade's hidden blade, which is in the Lynch version, but it's not set up, so the payoff doesn't really mean anything. But there's this idea in the book that Fade has like a blade hidden in his belt, that he uses when in combat to kind of get one over on his opponents. And in the climactic battle, that kind of treachery comes back to bite him, because the blade gets stuck on the floor, and then Paul stabs him in the throat. And we didn't really have that neat little setup and payoff, which is, I would argue, maybe one of the most cinematic things in the book, even though it is so small. It has such a film-like, all right, we're going to set it up here, and then at the end of the film, during the final battle, it comes back. That's like screenwriting 101 in this massive, sprawling, complicated novel.
Yeah. I think part of why I liked one more is because of that more intimate feeling that you were describing, Zach, and because of the sort of intergalactic politics of it. I enjoy the intrigue of Atreides basically being doomed to do this because the Emperor is requesting that they do it, even though they know it's a trap, but they know if they refuse that it'll be a disgrace to them. And I think Oscar Isaac's performance in that respect is really strong, even though he's got kind of this stoic, monotone thing going on a lot of the time. The way he interacts with his advisors and the way he interacts with just Paul, those are two very different scenes. And I think it also, the setting of part one, even though it's not at all like a George Lucas-y, Star Wars-y tactile thing in the sense that everything is worn to make you feel like in universe, or that things are realistically being used, because everything's very pristine. The costumes and the sets are very clean, but it kind of serves the same purpose as like the rustiness of the Millennium Falcon in Star Wars, because in part one, they're moving to this planet occupied by the Harkonnens, and it is this new place to them. And I think that in part two, there's maybe less of a justification for everything to feel so clean to me. And maybe that bothered me more. I'm not sure.
I'll say that there's something to be said about the grandiosity of the unknown, is what I'll call it. I'm coining the term now. And I think that the reason why the first one felt bigger in my head is because it felt like it was going on to be something bigger. Like I felt like we were building up towards something that was going to be grander, or like the planet, you're introduced to it, so you feel like it's a big planet with a lot of things going on. And now we know the importance of the planet. We know the importance of every house. We know the importance of every character already. We're just waiting for it to play out. And that's why I feel like for me, the second one felt like, even though it was physically larger and it was like it did present larger and was cinematically larger, I didn't get the sense in the plot that it was leading up to something great. I felt like it was kind of just a transitional period. And that is why I liked the first one better. I felt like the anticipation was a lot more fun in the first one than in the second one.
I'll second that.
Yeah, I mean, there was something I wanted to ask. I know we've kind of, or at least I have, danced around the Lynch version, which we talked about last season on the podcast. Is there anything that we think the Lynch version does better than the Villeneuve version. It's this famously derided disaster, but is there anything that you think holds up or that wasn't in the Villeneuve version that you felt like really should have been there?
I don't know. I don't think there's anything I would say is definitively better, but I will just give it a lot more credit in terms of informing Villeneuve, because I don't think aesthetically they're as different as they're reputed to be. I think the still suits are pretty similar between both films. I think the sort of interiors of Arrakis and the rooms that they're in, especially in the sort of part one segment of things, are pretty similar. Obviously, the visual effects aren't there, but I think the way that the shield is implied is vaguely similar. And I remember the box and the Gom Jabbar thing being the same too, but I could be misremembering.
That is pretty similar. I mean, the design of the Atreides as well is like very, very similar between the Lynch and Villeneuve versions. The Lynch leans into a lot more tan in the costume designs, but the kind of like military fatigues with the flags and everything is very much Lynch. My only thing is and if Villeneuve intends to do Dune Messiah, I do think this is going to be something that he maybe regrets not setting up. There is no mention or sight of the Guild Navigators anywhere in these first two movies, which is a really bizarre thing to try to explain. It's maybe one of the strangest things in the book, and one of the most off-putting and sudden things in the Lynch movie, but they're really important to the second book. And if Villeneuve hopes that that's going to be the wrap up of his trilogy, I worry that that's going to be something that they show up very suddenly and feel really out of place in this world that he's crafted, or he just tries to leave them out altogether, which I really don't think will work. Christian, I don't know if you've read the second book.
I have not read Messiah yet.
Okay.
I vaguely intend to before the third film comes out, but maybe I'll be rooting that one for me too. Who knows?
I think that weirdness, that weird, like completely off kilter, like inaccessible levels of weirdness that Lynch has is like second to none. I will say that the shields that are polygons are cooler than the shields now. I just want to let you know. I'm never gonna forget the freaking polygons. Okay,
that's just because you play Minecraft. That's why.
This has nothing to do with Minecraft. That has everything to do with shields in Perfect Dark and Goldeneye on Nintendo 64.
Huh.
Okay, fine.
But yeah, I just think there's something to be said about that. I think that dreamy psychedelic feel is a different way of accessing the material. I don't think it was good for me because Zach gave me one of the hardest English questions of all time, asking me to tell me what happened in the film. I don't know why he would ask me to say that, but other than that, I'm on board with what you guys said. Not much it does better.
In fairness to you, Mitchell, I had seen Denny's part one before we did our David Lynch, and I still couldn't possibly tell you what happened in the movie. That is an impossible question.
Patrick Stewart shows up.
He does with a pug.
With a pug. Nice.
I do think Lynch's Dune is a little more faithful to Chani in the book, which is also to Lynch's Dune's detriment, I think. Because in the book,
and that she's
I think
barely does anything.
Yes, that, but also in the book, she's, I think, a lot more passive, especially compared to Zendaya in part two, when she's more explicitly doubting Paul's destiny as the chosen one, and more, and this is a little bit in the book too, but more overtly having conflicts with Lady Jessica. And whereas in the book, and even in Denis part one, I think people were upset that Zendaya wasn't in the first film a lot. But compared to the book, they put in like a lot more dream sequency stuff with her, and Paul mentions her a lot sooner, and she's in the back of his mind a lot more in the film than early in the book. But in the book, she's like, you know, the manic dream girl, literally, and then she shows up, and they're like instantly smitten, and their romance is kind of, I think in the book, a little bit rushed, and I think she's very passive and just kind of like the girl in Paul's dreams and not much else, in the sense that makes her kind of a flat character. But in part 2, she has more agency, and the way in which the very end is changed capitalizes that even more. And I have mixed feelings about the ending with the marriage thing, but I do think that Chani is at least more interesting and has more agency in Villeneuve's films, not in a cringy way, and not in a way that's a huge change from the books, but just in a way that makes her relationship with Paul and Jessica and others more interesting.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think she's more of a character in Villeneuve's version compared to the book. But at the same time, especially the ending, has me worried for Messiah, because I don't want to spoil anything. I do get the impression.
I could take the headphones off.
I don't. I'm not going to be.
I'm ready to go.
I get the
Zach.
impression
Explain
that
to me
Villeneuve
the
has a
entire
plan for Chani, and he wants to do something very distinct and different with the character from what's in the text. But the kind of triangular relationship between the Princess Irulan, Paul, and Chani is vital as written to Dune Messiah. And the fact that Villeneuve deviates so substantially, I think, or is implying that he will deviate so substantially from that, has me a little worried that, I mean, Messiah might even just be an adaptation in name only. Because if he dashes that, I have no idea what he's going to make the plot about. Because that's a really, really important part of the second book.
We're just stranding Mitchell on not having read the book Island.
I will read the lit charts.
Mitchell.
I will read the lit charts the day before, so I'm ready for the Socratic seminar.
Well, I want to ask you guys about Florence Pugh and Christopher Walken. Thoughts?
Arrakis.
I think it's. I mean, I like Christopher Walken a lot. I don't think he's really tasked with giving much of a performance in this. There's like a 60-second interview I found with him on YouTube where someone asked him, like, how did you approach playing the Emperor? And he said, like, well, I was in a play 40 years ago where I played a king, and someone told me, you don't have to play the king. Everyone will play respecting the king. So I did that. I let other people play respect. So basically saying, I didn't really do anything. I just let other people act around me. And that gave my performance gravitas.
Wow. That's pretty much what awesome. I saw. Florence Pugh with the freaking chainmail variations. That was very aggressive. Yeah.
I like
He
them
reminded
both.
me, he reminded me of that one character in Megamind. When he's the
Space
old
Dad?
guy. Yeah, Space Dad in Megamind.
He does kind of look like Space Dad, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like Space Dad must have been based on him, at least in part.
Well, Space Dad is meant to be... The voice is Marlon Brando from Superman.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't look like Marlon Brando from Superman, though, so... Or, I don't know, maybe they based the Emperor on Space Dad.
Yeah, I think that was perfectly fine. I have no criticisms, really. I mean, I guess he was kind of given a good bit of screen time, and like, I think he fulfills that. Like I was talking about, like the archetypes thing. It's like the hero's journey archetype to a T, basically. I think he just fulfills that role perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, joking about Walken's performance aside, I do think that he... I think you really get the impression from his performance that the Emperor is a very old man who's been in a position of power for a long time. And at this point, it's more important that he, to everybody, because there's a lot of different players on the board here, it's more important to everybody that he just kind of continue to bear that power than that he actually do anything with it. So, and I think that comes across in the book as well, because the Emperor is largely kind of, you know, he gets frustrated about things and plays the manipulator, but really, like, the Bene Gesserit and the navigators are behind so much of the plot in the entire story of Dune. That he really is just a figurehead, and I do think you get that impression from the way that he's employed in the film.
Mm-hmm. I think I really like how part 2 starts in that it's like a diary entry that the princess is doing, because that's a device that Herbert uses for most of the novel. At the outset of each chapter, there's like a few sentences or a short paragraph of her giving her historical account of the characters and events of Dune. And it's really useful in the book because she's barely explicitly characterized. There's like one line about her being tall with sharp features and being a regal looking woman, and that's it. But with these excerpts, you get a sense of her intellect and the way she expresses at least her thoughts or her vision of the world and history around her. So I thought that was a great way to start the second film. And I also think that the supplemental scenes with her and the Bene Gesserit work really well. And I know Florence Pugh is not the tallest woman in Hollywood, but I think they do a good job of framing her in a way that it at least imbues her with a posture. And I mean, Timothy's not all that tall either, but they make it work.
Yeah.
I know because there was some hubbub that Anya Taylor-Joy was going to be in the. There's an interview where she goes, "My name's Anya, like aneurysm."
Nobody ever told me this.
Yeah, wow. This is like, we have to delete all of our old episodes.
This is like Cillian Murphy.
Yeah.
Like everyone was saying Cillian for a million years.
There was some hubbub that she was going to be in the film, and as soon as people heard that, everyone was like, "Oh, she's going to be Princess Irulan." And I do think that she fits that role more as written, but I do think that I get the impression that Villeneuve's going for maybe a more human Irulan than is in the text, and I think Florence Pugh delivers that really well, because Anya Taylor-Joy has that kind of like distant Slavic regality that I think would be it would make Irulan difficult to relate to, especially considering how little she's in the movie all in all, and how little kind of emotional material she really has to work with, and it's all kind of in the performance and the look of the character.
She's never playing a normal person in anything.
That's pretty true, yeah. My mother likes to say that she looks like a bug. She's got big eyes.
Thank you, Mom.
Well, yeah, I had an English teacher that said, like, to be a movie star in Hollywood, you have to have like really exaggerated features that look almost unnerving in person, but on screen they just make you like somehow sharper in an attractive way. I don't know. I wanted to ask you guys also about Rebecca Ferguson, because I think one of the like hardest to adapt things that Denis did keep without really modifying at all is her whole transformation in part 2 of drinking this like cursed blue liquid,
blue milk of Tatooine,
that makes her go galaxy brain and her fetus with her. And I remember reading that and just thinking, this is bizarre, and I don't know if it's working for me on the page, and how on earth are they going to do this on screen?
I like that they provide an origin for the water of life in the movie, because I do think that seeing the whole process of, even though based on stuff that's in the books, this does not make any sense according to the novels, but there's this whole idea that there's a baby worm in the water and we take it out of the sand and we put it in the water and then we draw the water of life out of it, and seeing that kind of natural, how it's made-esque process of like how they get the water of life, I think helped to make it feel a lot less strange, because it becomes this thing that we do on Arrakis instead of, and there's this strange blue liquid we need you to drink. So I think they did a good job of transferring that over. Like so many things in the Villeneuve version, it takes weird stuff from the books and treats it as if it's totally normal, which works for the world he's trying to build.
I definitely got the sense it was MacGuffin-y when Paul drank it. I think I just didn't. I was really trying to understand like the full effect of it and where it came from. I just feel like you're kind of you have that problem where you're just introducing an entirely new object, and you have to very precisely weave it into the story when it's just being brought up out of nowhere. You can't just be like, wait, I have the solution, and then just like put it in there. I just felt like it was a little bit too short of a time for me to just kind of just to believe like this is a part of the process. But then again, because it was so short, I felt like we were already kind of heading in that direction anyway. It felt more supplemental than necessary, so it wasn't a huge like criticism, but I just felt like they're making a huge deal out of it when I was just like, it's just a blue liquid. Like, I still don't really understand it. Like, I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to listen, but I wasn't catching on as much.
Yeah, it does feel kind of abrupt. And Jessica like pushes him to do it in the movie, which is interesting because in the book, he does it against her wishes. But I guess that change made sense because Denis was really kind of hammering home this whole Jessica and the Bene Gesserit are like forcing this destiny onto Paul that he doesn't really want at the outset. I also want to explain, I was laughing for a long time when Zach was explaining the worm thing. It's because Mitchell did a little dance when he was doing it. It was very funny. I wish you could have seen it, audience.
One day this will be a video podcast, and then you'll be able to see the very theatrical way in which I say things sometimes.
for our Patreon subscribers.
I'm determined to do at least one video special at some point in this show's run.
Where we'll meet up at Vegas and do a
oh God.
Yeah.
We'll drink ourselves to death.
Here we are in the lobby of Caesar's Palace to bring you a discussion of Freddy Got Fingered.
No.
Oh, I do have a question. So it was the Harkonnen relative reveal. Is that for later? Is that for something for later? Or is that not supposed to be relevant yet? Or
yes. But this is another thing that has me like, because that ultimately pays off in the third and fourth books, which Villeneuve has said he has no intention of adapting. So, yeah.
There better be a point, Zach. There better be a point. That
feels like something they could have cut with a little wiggle room, honestly, but I don't think it's to the detriment of the film as it exists now.
Okay.
So, are you asking about the reveal that Paul and Jessica are Harkonnens?
Yes.
Okay. I still think, I haven't read the third or fourth book, and though I intend to read Messiah, I don't really intend to read the others.
Yeah, you don't need to read Beyond Children of Dune, if I'm totally honest.
Yeah. I still think that reveal, if nothing else, serves to be, Zach's going to hate me for saying this, but basically an I am your father type moment where it's and obviously, Frank Herbert did it first, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still this, my blood is the blood of the enemy. I still think that moment has some dramatic effect on its own, though I think the placement of it is different than in the book too, but I don't know exactly in what way.
Now, I'm going to do an unusual thing here, and I'm going to argue for Star Wars. Because I will say that I think something that makes No, I Am Your Father a lot more impactful than the reveal as it's presented here is that in The Empire Strikes Back, which this movie has been compared, which part 2 has been compared to a lot, Luke is at like physically his lowest moment when that reveal comes from the man himself, and then that takes him even lower. Whereas in Dune, it's kind of like if Luke was hanging out on the Millennium Falcon after they lost like a space battle, and somebody else walked into the room and went, "Oh, by the way, did you know Darth Vader's your dad?" And he went, "What?" Oh well, where are we getting lunch? Like it doesn't.
The
quite
23andMe results have come in.
That it does.
We've discovered. Yeah.
That's very funny. And
I guess it's kind of emotionally impactful, but like, the boy gets murked. Like, oh, by the way, Grandpa, and then he just murks him right there. So.
It also has a bigger role in the book in terms of fueling this hysteria and suspicion of Jessica. Because, and this is another thing that's cut when they reunite with Gurney. In the book, at one point, he holds Jessica up at knife point because he's convinced that she's the one that betrayed them in the first half, not Dr. Yue. And there's this whole scene where Paul like talks him down, and then it's fine. But I don't remember how Gurney learns of this, or if how that information spreads. But Hawad and Gurney are both super suspicious of Jessica, and I think Paul is too. And in the movie too, I think Paul, at least for a little bit, is suspicious of his mother. Maybe in the movie not as much because of the Harkonnen blood thing, but at least because of the whole Bene Gesserit planned bloodline thing. Zach, you've been very fond of Toto did the score of the Lynch film.
Yes, they did. And I love that score. But what I will say is that that's a score that works for that movie and for the characters as they're adapted in that movie. I still think I like that score more, but I do think that Hans Zimmer here creates a score that works for this vision of Dune. I know that, Christian, you said that it felt a little more restricted in part 2. I didn't really get that impression as much. There's less throat singing. But the throat singing mostly came into play with the Sardaukar in part 1, and they're not in part 2 as much. So it's not really incorporated as much, and I was fine with that. It's another bombastic wallpaper score, I think, from Hans Zimmer, where in the moment you're like, oh my goodness, this is so exciting, and then afterward you don't really remember much other than
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really well timed though with the events, especially with the worm thing.
Yeah,
that was fantastic.
That was pretty really awesome, I've got to say.
Yeah.
I think that's another, like, that is, I can't explain it, but I think I'm just like the least enthusiastic person about the worms, and I can't really explain why. I know everybody thinks it's like the coolest thing, and I don't dislike it. I just like in the big scene when he's calling the big one and Stilgar's like, don't embarrass me and all that. They showed that actually when I saw the first film, when they did the IMAX re-release, they had a little sneak peek of part 2 at the end. And they showed that scene of him like calling the worm and writing it. And I was like, oh wow, I can't believe this is the sneak peak. This is like
not a sneak at all. This is like,
this is like everyone's favorite scene.
View.
Yeah. But it's definitely better than the Lynch worms, which are just kind of wriggling there.
Oh, I do.
I don't know.
I will say I don't mind the Lynch worms as much.
Lynch worm.
I don't think they're super threatening, but I do think you get a good impression of like the mass of them. And but yeah, the calling the calling Shai Hulud is not as much a scene that has a big impact for me. The bit that I was like, oh buddy, was when the 3 worms come out of the huge cloud at the end. That was, I mean, I would compare that to like when the army of ghosts comes out of the boat in Return of the King. It's this real sense of like the tide turning for lack of a better term, and to not get things complicated, the good guys. And in the moment, you're like, man, this is really cool.
I think you mean the scene in Endgame, Zach.
Which scene in Endgame?
Avengers Assemble.
Oh,
are you serious right now?
I mean,
cinematic
some,
masterpiece.
Yes.
Yeah, and you know when he whispers the word "assemble" so quietly that nobody could possibly hear him saying it.
Yeah,
assemble. Oh, he's running. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Drax
awesome.
is or Thrax. Drax. No, Thrax is from Osmosis Jones. Drax is at the back going, I don't know what he said, but it was probably cool.
Yeah, Christian's huge point every time, right? Every freaking time, Dave Bautista. Shut up.
Give this man like one successful fight in a movie, please.
I do think we're maybe coming to an end of the conversation here, but I did want to point out, I don't mind that Rabin gets absolutely just trumped in this film, but I do think in the book, I think that Rabin is like killed off screen. He's killed like between pages, and we find his body later. I think that what the Lynch film does with Rabin is a lot cooler than what they do in this film, where the Emperor arrives on world and the Baron Harkonnen comes into the room and Rabin's head is just on a spike in the corner of the room. I do think that's really cool, and makes the Emperor and the Sardaukar feel like a real threat to everyone, which I don't think is as much the case in this film.
Yeah. I'm winding down too. Let's see. We haven't mentioned Jason Momoa yet, and I just want to say I really like him in the first film, surprisingly. I know he's kind of just like Aquaman and now Fast and Furious guy to everyone, but I think he brings his charisma in a good way to the first movie, and I think he does a good job of playing this Atreides character, but still with the kind of roughness and sociability that makes him successful at communicating with the Fremen and kind of learning their ways and doing reconnaissance in that way. I think the MVPs of part one for me are probably like Isaac and Ferguson, though I really like Chalamet in part one too. And part two, I think Bardem is great, and I liked Florence Pugh a lot, though she doesn't show up as much.
I do like Duncan Idaho in the first film. Christian, you're gonna want to take off your headphones at this point. But Duncan Idaho is basically becomes like the main character of the Dune series from book 2 on, and I don't know if Momoa can carry that. That's all that I'll say on that matter. You can come back, Christian.
Wow.
Okay, so surely he just like comes back to life or something, because what else could it possibly be, right?
Wow.
I guess I'll have to wait and see.
Pretty crazy. What do I remember from the first one? No, I kind of agree with what Oscar Isaac. I appreciate how they refer to him and kind of honoring him and kind of emphasizing what the House of Atreides is like deems most important with their occupation as opposed to the Harkonnen. And I felt like that was something from the first one that you don't really ever get a sense of in the second one, just because things are the way they are. But yeah, just like learning about the House of Atreides and Thanos, awesome inclusion. I think we were talking about how he doesn't really have that much of a development in the first one, but I think you kind of get the sense of the relationship fairly quickly. I think Josh Brolin really conveys that fairly well. I just like that, having that peering into that already developed universe and having these characters like, hey, this is like the usual thing, like haha, and like, the buddy like, punching each other's shoulders and stuff, and like this is how the Atreides do stuff, and like that's kind of weird. You're like, you already know like the Fremen ways and stuff, but and you just like that mystery. It's just very fun, and it's reinforced by everybody you guys basically mentioned already. Yeah, I'm just not a fan of Zendaya. I don't know what to tell you. I like her in this a lot better than in like everything else, but like and then as MJ or anything like that. I just think, I mean, she comes across kind of as like this, like she's still growing up and she still has a lot to learn, but also like she's just emotionally invested and has a lot different priorities compared to the rest of the Fremen. And like, I like her inclusion about like the equality thing and like this is what the Fremen focus on, and I think that is a really cool dynamic, and I just don't like how she just constantly reiterates the same, like, oh, you're going to be a prophet now? Well, okay, then I don't like you anymore, and like, you're not going to be equal, then, yeah. So, yeah.
That wore on me a little in part 2, yeah. Yeah. Are we doing a weekend review? Did we decide this? I don't think we did.
I have something, but we could just move straight into the rundown if we want to keep it concise.
We'll just do a weekend review.
Yeah, I got time.
Okay.
Yeah, I got time.
I got time.
Well, I have been listening to a lot of James Taylor recently.
Really, I thought you were on Frank Sinatra for a million
was
years.
not on my big
I did listen to
Twitter.
a lot of Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra has a whole lot of albums, and I never got sick of Frank. But I will tell you, by the time I finished Frank, I was happy to move on to James Taylor. I'm going to make a comparison. I might not have any qualification to make here, but I do feel like James Taylor might be his generation's... I've forgotten his name. Guy that Taylor Swift dated, who Christian likes, who plays the guitar.
John Mayer?
Yes. I think that James Taylor may be his generation's John Mayer, because to a certain sect of people, they are some of the greatest singer-songwriters of their respective generations. And to an equally large other sect, they are utterly forgettable, unremarkable wigwags. That's white guy with acoustic guitar, for those unfamiliar with the acronym. I think I fall more into the first half. I specifically here, I'm talking about James Taylor's greatest hits, which I've been listening to a ton in the car over the past week. And this is a CD I listened to all the time as a kid, because my dad had that and Stevie Wonder in the car seemingly all the time when we were on the way to school when I was maybe 6 or 7. But the songs are simple and they're relatable, but Taylor's voice is really just beautiful. And I think he sings them with this feeling of experience and relatability that just makes it impossible not to feel emotionally connected to them in some way. There's messages like, I mean, Something in the Way She Moves, which was the basis for the Beatles song of similar title. This idea of having a woman or somebody in your life who makes things feel better. I feel fine anytime she's around me now. I think that's an incredibly relatable message. And then even kind of more upbeat things like How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, I think is impossible not to sing along to. Mexico and Shower the People have been stuck in my head for weeks. I've listened to this album so many times, and yet I'm not sick of it. My policy in the car usually is I listen to a CD once, and then I put it in the stack and come back to it next time I rotate through. But this has been in there for a while, and I don't see it coming out anytime soon. I don't usually review compilation or live albums, but I felt like this one was worth talking about and recommending, because it's really great. And I've had kind of an iffy March. I haven't had a ton of work, and I've felt down on myself quite a bit lately. And you know what? James Taylor's helped perk me up a lot. So a really solid recommendation for James Taylor's greatest hits.
They're so sweet.
I saw him live with my mom like a couple summers ago, and he's still in really great voice.
Nice.
Yeah.
Who next?
Mitchell.
All right, Mitchell will go. I've never been called on by Christian before, I don't think.
Yeah. Get ready for next season.
Alrighty. Well, land, air, and sea. Except we got land, a little bit of sea, and then the air. Masters of the air. I'm talking about Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg trying it again, the third time. And this time HBO was like, you know what? 350 million. I think we're gonna cut it off, and Apple, you have it. We're not doing this anymore. So this is what happens when you have budget constraints, right? I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. I learned a lot from it, historic perspective, and from like looking at trauma from war perspective, and the philosophy behind that. And I really enjoyed the aspect of learning from aviators, and learning about real aviation stories that almost nobody really ever hears about. And it's kind of a blind spot for a lot of World War II historians specifically. Aside from that, like production, procedural stuff, very clearly, basically on the money. And in terms of aviation techniques and like events that actually happened. All that stuff is extremely well documented, as opposed to coming from letters and biographies and memoirs. This comes from all of that, in addition to flight logs that have been corroborated like hundreds of times, and were like on the scene. There's on the scene interrogations right after every single operation. So there's a lot of really well documented information about it, and that's why a lot of people really wanted it to be a show. So the problems that ensue because of that. I still think it's a great show. I still think every episode is really fantastic and has a lot of really good emotional beats to it. I also think that it's very out of control when it comes to being consistently accounting the 100th squadron the entire time. And I think the problem for emotional investment comes into play because there's a lot of people, and there's only you have to, when you're not focusing on the missions, you have to focus on the interactions at the officers club, and you have to focus in on these random on leave interactions, which are cool to have, but in the grand scheme of things aren't very beneficial to the plot line. Or aren't very beneficial to the character development, which is probably the biggest detriment. The CGI is very questionable. I called it questionable because some people accept the way that it is and some people don't. There's not very many flying P-47s, P-51s, and B-17s around anymore, so it was very difficult for them to have actual flight scenes with planes. So a large majority of the scenes are CGI, which can be very troubling. You can tell they really stretched the budget out on that stuff. It's very easy to get loans on real equipment from real people that are like, just put it in the show. I really want to see it in the show. It's totally fine to use it type thing. It's very hard to have actual flying bombers from almost 100 years ago. So clearly that was an issue in the production department, which is sad, but I accepted it as somebody who's already invested to begin with. So yeah, those are my major criticisms with the show. I think it's totally worth watching. I think anyone who's at all interested in it and likes any of the actors to begin with, I think that's great. I think all the actors in general do a pretty good job. They're pretty convincing. I was worried it was going to become very Hollywoodified, and I didn't really get too much of the sense of that. It feels a lot more of a there's a lot more of a slickness to it compared to the grittiness of the Pacific and Band of Brothers, but on the other hand, I think it really does support that it's focusing on the officers, it's focusing on, these clean-cut conversations, and then the massive bombardments in aviation, and having these crazy, fighters coming in right and left, and flak coming from the bottom and everything, running out of fuel. All that stuff is really fun. It's really engaging. It's engaging in a very different way, and I really appreciate that. But I also think hard not to compare, but it's not going to hold a candle to the Pacific or Band of Brothers for me. But I do think it's worth watching at least the first few episodes. And I do think every episode does hold well on its own.
I gotta be honest, Mitchell, I started episode 1 and did not finish it, but I might go back to it. No promises, but I'll try.
And I don't have Apple TV Plus.
There you go.
And part of the reason why I put you on the spot there, Mitchell, is because I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about. I've been doing a few things. Been on a Toy Story rewatch. That's been fun. Haven't gotten to 4 yet, so I haven't gotten to the best one yet. But I watched Up in the Air on a Plane. Felt very meta doing that. But I think I want to default back to the last things I saw at the Cinematheque. One of the series that they're doing right now is a Werner Herzog series. Yes. Yeah. And I've enjoyed it a lot, but I think this is something I never would have predicted. I think I like his documentaries much more than his narrative features. Much more. The last one I saw was Fitzcarraldo, and I was frustrated with it. And we've talked about this before, especially on our Italian horror episodes, how much I struggle with dubbing or ADR in particular. And there's just so many scenes in Fitzcarraldo where Klaus Kinski will literally have his mouth closed and his character will magically say a whole sentence. And it just really bugs me. And I know it's from 1982, and I know the production was hell, and they hauled this big old boat over the mountain. But I felt like watching that play out wasn't very exciting. It's just a rare case of one of those things that sounds better in concept to me. But I did really love Grizzly Man more than I thought I would. Especially because in the past on the podcast, I've been very kind of reluctant to credit things that are morally ambiguous or not totally clear in their theme. But I thought this movie from 2005 depicting a character from the 90s, Timothy Treadwell, or not a character, a person, excuse me. He's obsessed with bears and he lives with grizzly bears for years until, shocker, things go horribly wrong. But it's just amazing how Herzog displays this sincere reverence for what he describes as Treadwell's eye for cinema. And he shows some really amazing footage of Treadwell with bears and foxes and how he captures nature in this very emotive way. But he also shows Treadwell at his worst, kind of like rambling about his problems with women and just at one point just like ranting about park rangers that he thinks are not helping the bears, when really what he's doing is like objectively not good for the bears either. But it was fascinating, but somehow it didn't feel perverse or exploitative to me, and I can't totally say why. But I love his narration, even though he's one of these names that are kind of quintessential film bro. I don't feel like his presentation in the documentaries are pretentious at all. I think he's very kind of down to earth and has a lot of respect for his audience. And so Grizzly Man was a 4.5, and I'm looking forward to watching more Herzog, and maybe we'll do one next season for a little fun.
One that I remember being really solid in comparison to Grizzly Man is Little Dieter Learns to Fly, which is also
They're showing that this weekend, and I intend to go.
I saw that one before I was like reviewing stuff and kind of before I really knew what I was talking about when I came to movies, but I do remember it being really good. And it has kind of a similar angle of being about someone with a mad passion that might be kind of difficult to understand.
Great. Well, wait, I'm not running anymore. I'm done running.
I'm running.
Yeah. You understand, walk the right way, Zach, and don't do it by the book. Do it the way you were taught. There you go.
Yeah.
There it is.
I'm Wadib. Pesky Paul.
Well, since we're doing 2 films here, I think we're going to do a 90-second and just kind of...
A little more time to run away from the worms.
Yeah, we'll fudge our way into some extra time. Oh, gosh, now I have to do math because I can't just do 1 minute on the timer. 1 minute and 30 seconds. Are we all ready?
Yeah, I'm ready, Spaghetti. Who's going first?
You are.
Alrighty.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
Desert Chance.
3 out of 5.
Ben and Gesserit.
3 out of 5.
Federally legalizing spice.
4 out of 5.
Hunter Seeker.
2 out of 5.
Fear being the mind killer.
4 out of 5.
Gom Jabbar.
4 out of 5.
The old black liquid bath.
4 out of 5.
Using the voice.
3 out of 5.
Introduction by bagpipes.
4 out of 5.
Hans Zimmer's unconventional score.
3 out of 5.
Putting hand in sus hole.
2 out of 5.
Hassan Al-Gaib.
4 out of 5.
Steel waifu instant betrayal.
2 out of 5.
Turning your back to an open door.
3 out of 5.
Arrakis.
3 out of 5.
Having dreams.
4 out of 5.
Scrubbing ass with Stan.
2 out of 5.
Javier Bardem mouth sounds.
4 out of 5.
Rebecca Ferguson's metamorphosis.
3 out of 5.
Southern beliefs.
2 out of 5.
Austin Butler's bald head.
4 out of 5.
There were weapons of mass destruction.
4 out of 5.
Florence Pugh as Princess Irulan.
4 out of 5.
Work action.
3 out of 5.
Gurney's song.
2 out of 5.
Paul the Desert Mouse.
3 out of 5.
Anya Taylor-Joy as developed fetus.
4 out of 5.
That's not hope.
3 out of 5.
Flying explosive rectangles.
4 out of 5.
Bautista abuse.
2 out of 5.
Zendaya stairs.
3 out of 5.
International law.
2 out of 5.
1 second.
World.
3 out of 5.
Time.
Wow, we jumped the list, Christian.
Oh man.
We jumped the list.
Oh yeah. Wow,
Did you
we totally
purposely
did.
not do the last few of the first one?
Yeah, because I was gonna just jump to part 2 when we were halfway through the timer.
Okay.
Okay.
I was on the point. I understand.
Yeah. You picked up on it very nicely.
Okay, good. All right, there's some good ones. The good ones.
Yeah.
left over.
All right.
Well, I don't think we have anything to announce, do we?
No, I don't think so.
Are we announcing another season officially?
We can announce that we hope for another season.
We're announcing that we will maybe announce another season one day.
Yes.
I love how this question is really just framed as Mitchell and I asking Zach for permission.
I mean,
Can we please do another one, Zach?
hey man, I'm basically unemployed. I'm always down for another season.
It sounds like we got to start running ads on this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully this summer we'll be back for some new discussions with guests new and old for I don't know how many episodes. But yeah, I mean, see you there, maybe.
See you there. See you then. See you anywhere.
All right. Until then,
Bye.
goodbye, everybody.